You've heard people say never lease a car, while others seem to have unlocked a secret bargain for driving a new car every few years. In this video, I'm going to peel back the mystery so you can better understand if leasing a car is right for you. You've picked out a car at a dealership and are faced with the decision, buy or lease. When you decide to lease, the dealership is the titled owner of the car and you're essentially renting it from them over a period of time, usually 3 or 4 years with a set mileage limit of 10 or 12,000 miles. After the lease period is up, you'll return the car to the dealership and then they sell it as a used car. Your lease payments represent the expected depreciation of the car over that time, plus a margin to cover the dealership's overhead costs, risk, and the dealership's cost of tying up their money for 3 or 4 years in that car, because money isn't free to them either. They could have spent it on more inventory to sell cars, but instead it's tied up for 3 or 4 years. Lease payments are set at an amount that covers all these costs that the dealership faces. Before going any further, I want to stop here for a sec. When you hear people say don't lease, I think what they usually mean is keep your car longer than the lease term. That's a fair point because buying something affordable and reliable and keeping it for several years beyond paying off your car loan, that's a good recipe for financial security to own an asset that's worth more than you owe. Getting a new car every few years costs more money because the fact is cars depreciate the fastest in their first few years. There's no getting around it. It's like getting a new flagship cell phone every couple years. Maybe that's important to you, but make no mistake, you're paying extra for that privilege. It's a choice. With that said, I'm not going to compare the merits of long-term car ownership in this video. My goal moving forward here is to make an apples-to-apples comparison between a lease and the equivalent buying experience. In other words, I'll compare a 3-year lease to buying a car and trading it in after 3 years. I want to help you to understand how to compare the total costs between leasing and buying, assuming your plan is to keep the car for only 3 years. Let's find a car for our example. I'm going to use Hyundai because their website is forthright with the prices and lease rates, but you should be able to find numbers like this from a salesperson at any dealership and compare the math for yourself. This car costs $37,060. It shows the lease details including cash up front and the monthly payments. If you want, you can change the mileage limits or the term and see how it affects your monthly payment. I'll stick with 12,000 miles and 36 months. If you buy the car instead, it shows the financing details. This is a pretty good interest rate deal on the loan at 2.49%, and it doesn't require a down payment. But you could see what would happen if you change the term of the loan. 60 months is 5 years, or 4 or 3 years would bump up your payments each month. Of course, a down payment would bring down your monthly payments. For now, I'll stick with the default 60 months and no money down. But just know you can reduce your overall interest expense by paying your loan off faster, especially with more money down up front. We're going to need to estimate the future depreciation of this car. I'm going to check out Kelley Blue Book. Kelley Blue Book, or KBB, estimates the average new car depreciates 39% over 3 years. This is an average, and it'll vary tremendously based on the type of car you're buying, the class of vehicle, the brand, and many other factors. But let's say for our example that 39% is the best forecast of your car's depreciation. I'm going to use that as the benchmark for this example, but when you know what car you're interested in, you should definitely do more focused research on the expected depreciation for your particular case. I'm applying 39% depreciation to our example car, which costs $37,060. That comes to $14,453 of depreciation. And the residual value after 3 years would be $22,607. Here's the thing, whether you lease or buy a car, it depreciates the same amount and you're paying for that depreciation either way. The difference is, with a lease, the dealership forecasts depreciation at the start of the lease and factors it into the payments, because they're not setting out to lose money on that lease. As far as you're concerned, the depreciation is predetermined and known up front, whereas when you buy a car, depreciation isn't exactly known until you sell the car. It could be 39% or maybe more or less. Don't take my word for it. Let's look closer at the cost of leasing and what the numbers represent. $2,997 due at signing, $440.37 per month for 36 months. Multiply that together and you get $15,853 plus $2,997 upfront equals $18,850. Remember, we figured depreciation would be $14,453. So why is $18,000 more than $14,000? Because the dealership has to cover depreciation and market risk as the car's owner, but also the cost of tying up their money, their own tax obligations, overhead costs, and a profit margin. In addition to the $18,850 from lease payments and cash up front, you'll also pay sales tax, but only based on the sum of these payments instead of the whole value of the car. Sales tax rates vary a lot depending on where you live. Where I live, it's 10% sales tax. I know it's pretty high, but that does make the math easy. Just know your results will vary based on where you live. Estimating the total cost of a lease is pretty easy. You just sum up the monthly payments, the cash up front, and your sales tax on the lease payments. And the total cost to lease is $20,735 over 3 years. It's a little less intuitive to calculate the ownership cost of buying because it's not as simple as summing up your loan payments. Comparing apples to apples, the total cost of buying is the sum of depreciation, sales tax, and interest expense. Starting with that same $37,060 Hyundai, assume you plan to sell it 3 years later, which is the same period of time as the lease we just looked up. Using that same 39% 3-year depreciation factor from Kelley Blue Book, that leaves us a trade-in value of $22,607. That's $14,453 of depreciation. Sales tax is based on the sale price of $37,060. At 10%, that comes to $3,706 of sales tax. Although your monthly loan payments aren't part of this comparison, you do need to account for the interest paid on the car loan. Let's dig into the loan payments. In the configurator, remember we had $0 down, and on a 60-month or 5-year loan at 2.49% interest, the payments were $653.23 a month. Multiplied by 60 months, that's $39,494. And if you subtract the sale price of $37,060, that's $2,434 of interest expense. That's a quick way to figure the interest you'll pay over the 5-year loan. But we're assuming you'll sell the car after only 3, with a balance still remaining on the loan. If you want a precise number, you can plug your loan specs into an amortization schedule like this one I found on the internet at calculator.net. In the first 3 years, you'll pay $1,990 of interest, a little bit less than the total over 5 years, which was $2,434. The cost of owning a car over 3 years is the sum of depreciation, sales tax, and interest paid on the car for a total of $20,149. It's important to note that the cost of owning a vehicle is not simply the sum of your loan payments. My math shows buying this car and trading it in after 3 years is potentially cheaper than leasing, but it's close. It's not a coincidence that these numbers are close. By design, you should arrive at a similar total cost whether you buy or lease. And the results of this comparison are sensitive to a number of factors. Right now, the car in my example has a very low interest rate, probably subsidized by Hyundai below the typical new car interest rate. If your lender charges a higher interest rate, that would make buying less attractive. Another factor to consider is, are you planning to trade in a vehicle? Because the value of your trade-in vehicle is normally deducted from the basis of the sales tax calculation, which would tip the scales more in favor of buying. For example, if you're trading in a used car worth $20,000, you would only pay sales tax on the difference. So $37,000 minus $20,000 is $17,000. That would be just $1,700 of sales tax at 10% instead of $3,700. Also, manufacturers periodically promote both leases and loans based on market conditions. Because the results depend on your particular circumstances and timing, use these principles to compare the math for yourself in your own car search. Here's an overview of the benefits of leasing. Leases tend to have lower monthly car payments than a car loan. Lease payments are almost always less than loan payments because you don't own the asset when you're done. Also, potentially you'll have lower sales tax obligation. Remember, the tax is based on your payments and down payment instead of the entire car's value at the time of sale. But this could be mitigated if you trade in a vehicle against the purchase price when you buy a car. The biggest reason to lease is peace of mind because you know exactly what you're getting into. The cost of depreciation is known and negotiated up front. Remember, that doesn't mean less depreciation. You pay for the depreciation whether you buy or lease, but the amount is known up front with a lease. And you won't have to worry about a lowball trade-in offer later. That's settled from the start. Leasing is easy. It's for risk-averse people, not because you're spared from depreciation, but because it won't sneak up on you. If you like prepaid services, leasing might be a good option for you if you find the right deal. And there are often promotions for leases that could tip the scales that way if you know how to compare the math. The negatives of leasing are, even though you're spared the risk of unknown depreciation, the dealer is not. The dealer might be surprised in 3 years that your car depreciated more than they had expected. And because the dealership is taking a risk, they're going to incorporate that risk into your lease payment amount. They'll hedge against the risk with a marginally higher lease rate, whether in the form of higher payments or cash up front. In other words, you pay the dealer's risk instead of taking that risk yourself. You don't see it because it's baked into the payments. You might find the mileage limit to be a negative. Some people will find this limiting only being able to drive 10 or 12,000 miles a year, or whatever the terms of the lease are set at. If you regularly drive 20,000 miles a year, leasing will be tough for you. If you are driving significantly fewer miles, then you're leaving money on the table, so to speak. So this could be a negative depending on your situation. Usually a lease requires a large upfront cash payment to start, although car loans often require down payments also, so it might just depend on your circumstances. If you don't have a lot of cash, it may be hard to start a lease. On the other hand, if you buy a car and trade in another car you own, that trade-in becomes your down payment. Another negative is there's no equity because the car's not yours. That also affects your next transaction as well because you won't benefit from trading in the leased car. You have less control. It's normally possible that you could buy your lease out after 3 years, but it will be costly to start from square one with a loan on a used car. Imagine starting a 5 or 6 year car loan on a car that you've already made 3 years of lease payments on. How much interest that amounts to. If you intend to own the car longer than your lease term, it's cheaper to buy it in the first place and get a new car loan from day one. Overextending. I see overextending as the biggest potential downside of leasing. Because lease payments tend to be lower than loan payments, there's a deceptive tendency to buy more car than you otherwise could afford. I hope showing the math in this video will help you to assess your own new car transaction and whether you're overextending in the long run. Here's a recap of the components for comparing the math. For the total cost of a lease, add up the cash up front, the sum of the lease payments, and the sales tax based on those two parts. For the total cost of buying, it's the sum of depreciation, which is the new car's price minus the estimated future trade-in value, the sales tax based on the sale price, after deducting your current trade-in potentially, and the interest expense while you own the car and are making car payments. I'll leave you with my top 5 takeaways. Dealerships aren't in the business of losing money. Lease rates are determined with math to arrive at similar dealer profit margins for both leases and traditional car sales. In other words, leasing isn't a hack for a cheaper car. You're still paying a premium to have a new car every few years. Number 2, leasing does not avoid depreciation. It's pre-negotiating the depreciation. Almost every day I hear someone say, that car will depreciate a lot, so therefore you should lease it. Now you know that you pay for the depreciation whether you buy or lease. If you're not comfortable paying for a heavily depreciating vehicle, then maybe look for a different car. Don't be fooled when a salesman tries to compare lease payments to loan payments. The cost of owning a car is not the sum of your loan payments. Be careful not to overextend. Relatively lower payments might entice you to get a higher value car than you otherwise would consider. And finally, make a decision that's right for you. Of course, you should consider long-term ownership and used car ownership, which were not the focus of this video. But assuming you're looking for just a few years with your car, be prepared to compare the total cost of leasing and buying. One option is not always better than the other. Manufacturers tend to subsidize loans and leases depending on market conditions. Compare the math for yourself to see which is best in your circumstances. I hope this video has helped you understand how to compare apples to apples and see the cost beyond just the car payments. I appreciate your support. More content coming soon.